This man passed a homeless girl every morning when he went to work. So he came up with a plan to help her and brought food every day when he walked by. They slowly got to know each other, but he was shocked when he ultimately found out who she was. Man brings homeless girl food every day, shocked when he finds out who she is. Although Brandon lived in a big city, he could still walk to work daily because his office was near his apartment. He always took the same route, and someday he suddenly saw something he had never seen before. A homeless girl was sitting against the wall. She looked friendly, but everyone ignored her. Brandon noticed her from a distance and felt in his pockets for any money he had, but he had nothing on him. There was nothing he could do to help her, and he felt terrible as he passed her. And that feeling only grew stronger when she still sat there on his way home. However, the next day, Brandon felt completely different as he walked out of his apartment, as he had thought of something to help the homeless girl. When Brandon saw her, he quickened his pace and eventually stopped in front of her. The girl looked up in confusion as he held out a small container. Brandon made breakfast that morning and made an extra portion for the homeless girl. "Please take it," he said kindly, and after some hesitation, the girl grabbed the container from him. Her eyes lit up when she saw what it contained, and she thanked him heartily. Then, she carefully started to eat. The homeless girl was pleased with the food, and Brandon stayed to ensure she ate everything. Eventually, the girl was finished and handed back the container. When Brandon took it from her, he felt a wave of satisfaction come over him, and he decided on the spot he would bring her breakfast every morning. So, from that day on, he prepared 2 breakfast portions every morning. Every day, the girl would be in the same spot and grateful for his kindness. Eventually, Brandon sat beside her, and the two started talking. This slowly grew their bond, which resulted in them frequently eating their breakfast together. This ritual would go on for about 2 months. The two met every morning, and Brandon brought food for Ally, as the homeless girl was called. At first, it was mainly Brandon who talked, but little by little, Ally would open up more, and the two would really bond. At least, that's what Brandon thought. Because one day, when Brandon turned the final corner and looked toward Ally's spot, there was nothing to see. A frown appeared on his face, and he quickened his pace. Maybe she had moved slightly, or people were blocking her from sight. But when he arrived at her spot, there was no trace of Ally. Brandon stood where he had sat down every workday for the past 2 months and looked at his watch. He always arrived early so he could have breakfast with Ally and had some time to wait for her, hoping she would show up at any minute. But eventually, he had to leave for work. He put the container for Ally on the ground and left. But as he did, Brandon couldn't help but feel a little disappointed, as he thought they had bonded enough over the past few months for her not to leave her spot around this time. However, he would soon discover something else was at play. Later that day, Brandon walked back home and was surprised to see Ally still hadn't returned to her spot, and that remained true for the remainder of the week. He was disappointed to conclude that Ally had gone without saying a word. But little did he know their story was far from over. Brandon made peace with the fact that Ally was gone without saying anything and continued with his life. His morning commute went quickly, and he didn't have to get up so early anymore. But when he was ready to start his next work week, he was surprised to see that Ally had returned. He expected never to see her again, thinking she found a better place to stay. So when Brandon saw her in her spot again, he quickly approached her, as he had always done, even though he didn't have any food with him. He was curious about what she had been up to the past week. "I'm sorry, I didn't expect to see you, so I didn't make food for you," he said as he reached her. But he opened his bag nonetheless and took out an apple he had brought as a snack for himself. He sat down, but he immediately felt weird and off about it. Something was wrong. Ally didn't return his greeting, and he could swear he saw her move away slightly when he sat beside her. He was used to taking the lead in their conversations, but she barely reacted to his questions. It was like he was talking to a different person, or as if she didn't recognize him. Brandon's mind was racing as they sat in silence. Why did she act so strangely? What was different? And then a thought struck him. He didn't have any food for her apart from the apple. The thought hurt him, as he believed they had a friendly connection. Was it all about food for her? "Just wait here," he said as he got up and hurried back home to get some food for her. Brandon quickly made a simple breakfast and raced back to Ally. He was breathing deeply when he tried to sit beside her, but Ally suddenly yelled at him. "Go away. Don't come to me anymore." Brandon was startled by the tone in her voice and immediately stood upright. He was happy she remembered him, not only for the food, but he was also confused by her behavior. He only tried to help her, and he thought she had liked his help and attention before. What had changed? Now that Ally was back, Brandon realized he had actually kind of missed their breakfast ritual the last week. Together with her sudden behavior change, that was enough for him not to give in so easily. "What do you mean? What's going on?" he asked, but Ally insisted that he left her alone. The situation was slowly escalating, and people started to stare at him as a homeless girl was yelling at him to leave her alone. Realizing this was getting out of hand, he frustratingly put down the container he got for her and walked away. What had gotten into her? Did something happen last week? Brandon arrived at work a little later than usual and threw his bag on his desk. He tried his best to continue his day normally, but his mind kept drifting off to Ally and her strange behavior. Something didn't seem right, and he wanted to know what was going on. On his way home, he passed her again and tried to get her attention. But as he had expected, she acted like he wasn't there and looked the other way. Brandon then continued his journey home with a smile on his face as he had devised the perfect plan to counteract her behavior. He would smother her with kindness. That way, she couldn't ignore him for long, and he could regain her trust. In the last few months, he noticed her sleeping bag was increasingly damaged, and the weather was getting colder. So, later that night, he returned to Ally with a new sleeping bag and hot food. It was a dirty play, but Brandon wanted to know what was going on, and he thought this was the fastest way to find out. As he had expected, Ally couldn't say no to the new sleeping bag and hot food, but she still ignored his presence and didn't respond. Until Ally suddenly broke her silence. "Why do you keep coming back?" she asked hesitantly, but Brandon could swear he heard a hint of curiosity in her voice. The man explained he wanted to know why she behaved so strangely this morning and that he was worried something might be wrong. When Brandon mentioned Ally's change in behavior, he could see her slightly flinch, and she looked away from him. This gave Brandon even more cause to feel concerned about the homeless girl. "What's going on? Did something happen last week? You can trust me. Please talk to me like we always did," he said gently. But the moment those words left his mouth, Ally started sobbing. Brandon's body froze, and he looked at her in panic, not knowing what to do or what he did wrong. "The last person who said that to me couldn't be trusted," she said between sobs, increasing Brandon's worries once more. Brandon's mind was racing, and a frown appeared on his face. Ally's response both confused and worried him. "What do you mean? What happened? Is that why you weren't here last week?" he asked. Ally continued sobbing and eventually nodded. "Please tell me." "I want to help," Brandon said with a concerned voice. Ally looked at him with teary eyes and sniffed. She wiped away her tears and took a few deep breaths. Then she explained that someone had approached her last week. The person told her he could help her with her past and find answers. "But he lied and mistreated me," she sniffed. Brandon was alarmed when he heard her say that. "Mistreated you? Are you okay?" he asked instantly. But he was also confused, and his mind kept filling with questions, so he couldn't help but blurt out more before Ally could answer. "How could he help you with your past? What happened?" Ally began by saying she was fine, but he had promised to take care of her and lied about it. It had been a hard week because of it, and she was very disappointed that he was also lying about her past. "I really hope to get out of this situation," she sighed. With every answer Ally gave, more questions arose in Brandon's mind, so he tried his best to get the facts straight. "What is your situation? What happened in your past? Why could the man help you? What is going on exactly?" he asked her. But he wasn't ready for her response. "I don't know." "And that's the problem," Ally said, explaining that she doesn't remember much of her life. When she tried hard, she could remember snippets, but everything was blank from a certain age. "I've been looking for answers for a long time," she said. Brandon was in disbelief and shocked to hear this. "I'm so sorry," Brandon eventually said when he recovered from the surprise. Ally shrugged and said she was used to it by now, but she was still looking for answers. "The most prominent things I can remember are an accident, a hospital, and waking up in an unknown house with unknown people," Ally added. Brandon listened speechlessly as Ally told her life story. She explained it was too overwhelming for her. "Everything was unknown, so I ran away to find something I knew. I searched for days and found nothing. Eventually, I settled here in this unfamiliar city," Ally said, tears forming in her eyes again. Ally looked down and held her hands before her face. Brandon felt powerless and astonished. "You don't remember anything else?" he asked in disbelief. Ally shook her head again. He felt incredibly bad for the girl and wanted to help her. "Have you gone to the police?" he asked her. Ally looked up again after he asked the question, and he could see a regretful expression on her face. She explained she tried to go to the police multiple times, but as Brandon might have noticed, she wasn't very socially skilled and didn't trust people. So she turned away at the last moment. The words had just left her mouth when Brandon abruptly got up. "Then I will help you," he exclaimed. He offered his hand to help her get up. "Together, we will get you out of this predicament," he said determinedly. Ally looked at him hesitantly, but eventually she grabbed his hand and stood up. Ally accepted Brandon's help, but she remained hesitant. Even though the previous man lied about it, he started by saying he knew something about her past. Brandon didn't know anything, so how could he help her? But he convinced her to go to the nearest police station and get their help. The duo immediately caught the attention of multiple police officers, as Brandon wore nice clothes, and Ally was obviously a homeless person. But Brandon ignored the stares and guided Ally toward the front desk, where they tried to explain the situation the best they could. They were instructed to wait, so they did anxiously. Brandon's leg nervously twitched as the minutes passed until, finally, an officer approached them. He asked them to follow and guided Brandon and Ally to a room. Once everyone sat down, he told the duo he would help them get to the bottom of this. Brandon looked at Ally. "It will be all right," he said. Brandon could see Ally was nervous and tried his best to support her. The officer had tasked the homeless girl with telling them as much as she could remember from her life. "Everything you can think of, no matter how small," the officer said. That info would be the starting point of their investigation. It was hard work, and Brandon noticed it took a heavy toll on Ally, but she persisted until the officer was satisfied. After the interview, Brandon and Ally remained at the station the entire night, helping the police if needed. Eventually, early in the morning, the officer approached them with good news. "I found something," the officer said as he held up a document. He explained that he had searched through the files of missing persons the entire night and found one that matched Ally's story. "There was an accident with a girl who recovered at home and ran away," he said. "But that wasn't all. It's a cold case from 10 years ago," the officer added. Brandon was shocked to hear this and looked at Ally. Had she been missing for 10 years? Had she been looking for answers all that time? But when he looked at her face, he saw pure joy and felt incredibly happy for her. The police officer took them back to the room and discussed the cold case with them. If the person from this case was really Ally, she was from a city 8 hours away from here, and the case had been cold for many years because they never searched in this area of the country. The officer didn't want to give her false hope, but there was only one way to find out if this case was actually about Ally: a DNA test. Ally agreed immediately, and everything was set in motion. The police contacted the parents while Ally was escorted to the hospital with Brandon by her side. They took some of Ally's saliva at the hospital and gave her an overall checkup. When the parents arrived, they were held separately until the test was complete. When the DNA was a match, They were let in, and Brandon witnessed a very emotional reunion of parents and child after 10 years. When the parents heard the story, they couldn't thank Brandon enough, but he was just thrilled that everything worked out perfectly. Ally then returned to her childhood home, but the distance couldn't keep her from Brandon. They stayed in touch, and he became a close friend of the family, whom he would often visit.